In the early 1930s, the United States Navy looked to the clouds and saw a future that looked like something out of a Jules Verne novel. Looming over the hangars in New Jersey and California were the USS Akron and the USS Macon, the largest, most complex flying structures ever conceived by man. These weren't just blimps, they were rigid airships, silver titans spanning 785 feet in length. To put that in perspective, they were only 20 feet shorter than the Hindenburg, but they weren't designed to carry socialites across the Atlantic. They were built for war. As you stood beneath the shadow of the Macon, the sheer scale was disorienting. Its duralumin skeleton was covered in miles of shimmering fabric, housing 6.5 million cubic feet of helium. But the true marvel wasn't the ship itself, it was what was hidden inside its belly. Located midship was a concealed internal hangar, a cavernous space that held a squadron of 5 Curtiss F9C Sparrowhawk fighters. This was a flying aircraft carrier. The Sparrowhawks weren't launched from a runway. Instead, a massive T-shaped opening would yawn wide in the floor of the airship, exposing the clouds thousands of feet below. A mechanical trapeze arm would lower a fighter into the slipstream. The pilot would start his engine, the roar of the radial motor echoing inside the hollow giant, and then, with a metallic clack, the hook would release. The biplane would drop like a stone before catching the air and soaring away to scout the horizon. The vision was clear, a mobile, floating airbase that could stay aloft for weeks, patrolling the vast reaches of the Pacific Ocean. While traditional seabound carriers were limited by the speed of the waves, the Macon could sail over the fleet at 80 miles per hour, launching its parasite defenders to intercept enemies before they were even visible from the mast of a battleship. It was a steampunk dream realized in duralumin and silk, a silver god of the skies that promised to change the face of naval warfare forever. But as the Sparrowhawks buzzed around their mothership like angry wasps, the engineers knew they were operating on the razor's edge of physics. The dream of the rigid airship wasn't just about size, it was about the long watch. In an era before satellite reconnaissance and long-range radar, the U.S. Navy was terrified of a Pearl Harbor-style surprise attack. They needed eyes in the sky that could see for hundreds of miles. The USS Macon and its sister ship, the Akron, were the billion-dollar answer to that fear. They were designed to be the eyes of the fleet, scouting the Pacific in silence, far above the reach of surface guns. Walking inside the hull of the Macon was like walking through the ribcage of a metallic whale. A crew of nearly 90 men lived within the duralumin skeleton, navigating narrow catwalks that spanned the dizzying heights of the internal gas cells. There were bunk rooms, a mess hall, and even a smoking room, though strictly regulated due to the proximity of flammable materials. It was a self-contained city suspended in the air. At the heart of this aerial city were the trapeze artists, the pilots of the F9C Sparrowhawk squadron. These men were a breed apart. To fly for the Macon, you had to be more than a pilot. You had to be a high-wire performer. Because the airship was a flying carrier, weight was the enemy. To maximize their scouting range, the Sparrowhawks often flew with their landing gear completely removed. In their place, engineers bolted on belly tanks of extra fuel. This was a terrifying commitment. By removing the wheels, the pilot surrendered any hope of a conventional emergency landing on a field or a traditional carrier deck. If they couldn't find their way back to the Macon in the middle of the vast ocean, they were going into the water. Leading this daring group were officers who believed the airship was the pinnacle of naval evolution. They saw the Macon not as a fragile balloon, but as a battleship of the clouds. They pioneered the use of the subcloud car, a small, streamlined observation basket that could be lowered on a cable thousands of feet below the airship. While the Macon hid safely inside a thick layer of clouds, a single observer in the car could hang in the clear air below, telephoning coordinates of enemy ships back up to the mothership. It was a masterpiece of 1930s stealth technology, powered by nothing but nerves of steel and miles of cable. But as the Macon pushed further into the stormy latitudes of the Pacific, the crew began to realize that their silver fortress was only as strong as its weakest strut. Landing an airplane on a traditional carrier deck is often described as a controlled crash, but landing a plane on the USS Macon was a high-altitude ballet that defied common sense. There was no runway, no arresting gear, and no margin for error. To return to the mothership, a Sparrowhawk pilot had to perform the Trapeze Maneuver, a feat of airmanship so dangerous it made standard combat flight look like a hobby. As the pilot approached the silver underbelly of the giant, he wasn't looking for a flat surface. He was looking for a slender, T-shaped metal bar swinging in the turbulent slipstream. The Macon would be cruising at roughly 60 miles per hour, but the air churning around the massive hull created prop wash and unpredictable eddies that could swat a small biplane like a fly. The pilot had to fly upward, matching the airship's speed precisely, positioning his aircraft so that a small overhead hook, affectionately called the skyhook, was inches away from the trapeze bar. The tension in the cockpit was suffocating. If the pilot flew too fast, he risked ramming the airship's fragile fabric hull, potentially triggering a catastrophic structural failure. If he flew too slow, the stall speed would drop him into the abyss. The pilot had to stare upward through the caban struts of his top wing, judging the distance by eye. When the hook finally made contact, the pilot would pull a lever, and a mechanical clack would signal that the Sparrow was home. But the maneuver wasn't over. Once hooked, the engine had to be cut immediately. The trapeze arm would then tilt upward, lifting the plane through the belly door and into the dark, echoing interior of the hangar bay. Inside, crewmen would swarm the aircraft, manhandling it onto overhead rails to clear the pit for the next returning fighter. During training exercises, the Navy pushed the limits. They practiced night recoveries, where the only guide was a dim light on the trapeze arm and the pale reflection of the moon on the Macon's hull. They proved it could be done, but every recovery was a gamble with physics. The Sparrowhawks were the only planes in the world that spent their entire lives in the air, launched from a hook and returned to a hook. It was a flawless system on a calm day, but the Pacific Ocean was rarely calm. The trapeze artists were masters of a craft that was about to meet its match in the violent, unpredictable weather of the California coast. The end of the age of the flying carrier didn't come in a blaze of enemy fire. It arrived in the cold, gray turbulence of a February evening in 1935. As the USS Macon sailed past Point Sur, California, it was returning from fleet maneuvers, its belly heavy with Sparrowhawk fighters. But the silver giant was wounded before the storm even hit. A structural weak point in the tail, damaged months earlier over the Texas desert and never fully repaired, was about to become a fatal flaw. Suddenly, a violent wind shear slammed into the airship. To the men inside the hull, the sound was like a gunshot amplified 1,000 times. The upper tail fin, unable to withstand the torque, literally snapped off and was swept into the Pacific. As it tore away, jagged duralumin girders shredded the rear helium cells. What followed was a slow-motion nightmare. The Macon was now tail-heavy and hemorrhaging lift. Commander Herbert Wiley, a survivor of the Macon's sister ship Akron which had crashed years earlier, knew the stakes. He ordered the engines to full power, attempting to use the ship's forward momentum to force the nose down, but the airship began to rise uncontrollably. The Macon shot upward like a panicked whale, climbing from 2,800 feet to nearly 5,000 feet, an altitude where the thin air caused the remaining gas cells to vent automatically. The ship was now a 200-ton brick. Inside the ribcage, the scene was one of desperate, calculated chaos. "Dump everything," was the cry. Crewmen raced along the narrow catwalks, frantically pulling levers to release thousands of pounds of fuel and water ballast. They even considered pushing the Sparrowhawks out of the hangar bay to save the mothership, but there wasn't time. The Macon was settling tail first into the dark waves. Unlike the violent, fiery death of the Hindenburg, the Macon's end was eerily gentle. It took 20 minutes to descend. The crew had enough time to don life vests and prepare the rafts, a lesson learned from the Akron disaster where most men drowned because they lacked flotation. As the tail struck the water, the giant airship didn't explode, it simply collapsed into itself like an accordion. 81 of the 83 men aboard escaped into the sea, watching from their rafts as the silver skin of the world's last flying aircraft carrier slipped beneath the surface of Monterey Bay, taking its 5 pristine fighters down into the abyss. The sinking of the USS Macon wasn't just the loss of a ship, it was the funeral for an entire branch of aviation. When the silver giant disappeared beneath the waves of the Pacific, it took the Navy's dream of a flying fleet with it. The crash proved a brutal reality. These silver titans were too fragile for the violent physics of the open ocean. Congress, reeling from the loss of both the Akron and the Macon within 2 years, refused to fund another rigid airship. The era of the flying aircraft carrier was over before it ever truly began. The transition was swift and ruthless. The Navy turned its full attention to fixed-wing carriers like the Lexington and the Saratoga. The trapeze artists of the Sparrowhawk squadron were reassigned to flat-deck carriers, their days of hooking onto swinging bars in the clouds replaced by the screech of tailhooks on wooden decks. The steampunk reality of giant, humming airships patrolling the horizon was filed away as a failed experiment, a beautiful but impractical detour in the history of war. For decades, the Macon lay in total darkness, 3,000 feet deep on the sea floor of Monterey Bay. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s, using advanced robotic submersibles, that humanity looked upon the flying carrier again. The images sent back were haunting. The duralumin skeleton had collapsed, looking like the bleached bones of a prehistoric sea monster. But inside the wreckage, researchers found a sight that took their breath away: the 4 Sparrowhawks. Still tucked in their internal hangar, the tiny biplanes were remarkably preserved. Their silver wings were covered in deep-sea silt, and their skyhooks were still extended, reaching upward as if waiting for a mothership that had long ago dissolved into the salt. They are the only 4 F9C Sparrowhawks left in existence, resting in a graveyard that no human can reach without a submarine. The legacy of the Macon lives on today as a what-if of epic proportions. It remains a testament to a time when we weren't afraid to build the impossible. The concept of the parasite fighter eventually evolved into modern drone technology and mid-air refueling, but we have never again built anything with the sheer, romantic scale of the Macon. It stands as a shimmering ghost in the history of the sky, a reminder of a brief window in time when aircraft carriers didn't just sail the seas, they sailed the clouds. The true legacy of the USS Macon is not found in the wreckage at the bottom of the Pacific, but in the blueprint it left behind for the future of unmanned warfare. While the rigid airship itself died in 1935, the concept of a mothership, a central hub capable of launching and recovering smaller, specialized craft, never actually went away. Today, as the U.S. military experiments with Gremlin drones and massive cargo planes acting as airborne launch platforms, they are essentially walking in the footsteps of the Macon's trapeze artists. The Sparrowhawk pilots were the human ancestors of the modern drone swarm. But beyond the technology, the Macon represents a lost chapter of American optimism. In the 1930s, the world was gripped by the Great Depression, yet the United States was still willing to gamble its dwindling treasury on a silver dream that spanned nearly 800 feet. It was an era of grand engineering, where the solution to every problem was to build it bigger, fly it higher, and coat it in duralumin. The Macon was the pinnacle of that philosophy, a machine so majestic it made the future seem like it had already arrived. When you look at the deep-sea footage of those 4 Sparrowhawks today, it's hard not to feel a sense of melancholy. They represent a steampunk timeline that was abruptly cut short. Had the Macon survived, we might have seen airship carriers patrolling the Atlantic during World War II, or nuclear-powered versions circling the globe during the Cold War. Instead, the Macon remains a technological outlier, a mechanical ghost that proved the sky was a much more violent place than our imaginations allowed. The story of the USS Macon is a reminder that progress is rarely a straight line. Sometimes, humanity builds something so magnificent and so daring that the world simply isn't ready for it. The silver giants are gone, their fabric rotted and their skeletons crushed by the weight of the ocean, but the memory of the flying carrier still haunts the clouds. It stands as a testament to a time when we looked at a 785-foot airship and thought, we can make that carry an air force. It was the ultimate, what if, and it remains the most beautiful failure in the history of the United States Navy.